YouTube, and welcome to another Zen and Art of Miniature Painting video. And in this video today I'm going to show you how I paint the stable from Tabletop Workshop. Now, in my previous video on the medieval barn, Cam Cell asked me to please upload a tutorial and painting guide, and so this is my attempt at that. This is new for me in terms of a format, so I'd appreciate any feedback you could give me. Much like the other Tabletop Workshop boxes, as you can see here, the instructions are printed on the inside of the lid. They're very simple kits and they slot together quite easily. Nothing new to see here really. They're built upon the basic skeleton. The only difference with the stable is that it has one wall which actually looks like a stable, so the one with the big arches. So here I am pointing them out to you. As you can see, these are the same end pieces we've seen with all their other buildings except I think for the church. And this has the same little notched bottoms that slide in. That's the stable side there. Sorry about these camera angles. I think in the future I'll have to try and figure something out that works a bit better. But the nice thing about this kit is that everything slots together quite easily, so there's a minimal amount of gluing to be done. As you can see here, everything's coated in black, so I started with a black undercoat. I just went down to Halford's, it's a local like car parts store here, and just bought some cheap car spray paint in black, acrylic black spray paint, and just knocked that up one day. The real reason for the undercoat here is simply just to give the paint something to grip to. And as you can see here, I'm showing you how the whole thing clips together. It all just basically pops in nice and easy. And once you've seated everything, it's pretty easy to work with. If you've seen any of my other videos of these kits, you'll notice that you can do some interesting things with them in terms of making cross sections. You know, skirmish terrain at its best really, with removable roofs. And although not very sophisticated, they do look very good. So the paints I use here are very cheap acrylic paints. I went down to my local Hobbycraft and I bought these. I think they're about £1 a pot or something. I bought them several years ago. I use them for basing a lot of the times. They're quite tacky paints and they don't flow very easily. I also used some foundry greys. Just whatever greys you have lying around will do the trick. You're just looking for a couple of tones. And then obviously I have a sort of mixing palette, some water, and then some relatively large brushes. So I use a 1/4 inch brush there, I think, plus a flattish brush, and then a rounded brush. Big ones will do. There's not much detail work to be done here until the end. Okay, so I've sped time up a bit just to speed things along. And here you can see I'm taking my dark grey, I'm mixing it down on the palette. And as soon as it's mixed down to the consistency I want, which is quite runny because it doesn't need to be you know, particularly thick, I put the excess onto the actual piece of plastic itself, and then I just start whacking it everywhere with that 1/4 inch brush, and it's done. And then a magic hand dryer. That's it. That's the secret to painting loads of terrain really quickly. You just zap that with a hair dryer and you've got instantly dry paint. It's a great little trick. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it on nice fine figures, but I would on a piece of terrain. Trust me, it works. Next one up, I'm using a slightly lighter grey tone, and at this stage all I'm doing is using a flatter brush, and I'm going to dry brush that across there. And as you can see, even from this distance, you can just see the definition starting to come through. And all I'm doing is trying to look for make sure the recesses stay dark, and that the upper center pieces of the flagstones are grey. And again, I mean, there's no reason to belabor the point here, but it looks good from a distance, and that's really what terrain is all about. And again, I'm just zapping it with the hairdryer so that I don't touch it accidentally. Okay, now I'm moving on to my side panels. So I clean my brush, and I'm getting ready to rock. And so the first thing here we're going to do is use a brown, like a dark brown, like a burnt umber type color. Scorched brown, that kind of thing, or chocolate brown. I don't know what we'd call it. Just depends on the type of paint you use, but just a kind of dark brown will do the trick. And all I'm doing here again is just coloring in basically the wall itself. So I'm hitting the surrounding timbers in the wall itself. And most of this is going to get covered up, but the reason you want this is for that slight recess shading that's going to happen at the joins between the walls and the timbers. And again, using my magic little hair dryer to just make sure that it, you know, I can keep touching it basically. This is quite messy paint work, so you'll notice I have a lot of paper lying around, and cleaning your brushes is going to be a problem because obviously we're used to using small brushes which don't tend to retain that much paint. With these cheaper paints, they tend to be quite tacky and they tend to stay on the brush, and getting rid of them is quite a challenge. Even when you wash the brush, it'll stay on. There we go, nice and dry. And again, same again, the brown you can see in the bottom there. I've done all the other panels now. The roof itself, the thatching, just use a brown again. That's all it is. It's a base coat, yeah. And all I want to do here is make sure that we're getting good coverage and that it dries nicely, and so that as I'm handling it, I'm not wearing the paint away. The one downside of these cheaper paints is that they do tend to kind of rub off with your fingers if you're not careful. So do make sure that you're aware of the limitations of your paint. What I would say is, do not waste Games Workshop paints on this kind of work. It is not worth it. You will run out of paint very quickly and you will regret it. These paints have a very low pigment count, so you tend to have to use a lot of paint, and you can't water them down too much. They just tend to go to nothing really. They become very gloopy, which is not good. And again, here I'm just using my hairdryer to move things along. My wife loaned me hers, luckily. Right, next thing, I'm using a kind of yellow brown. Now this is going to be the next level of the straw for the thatching. And you can see I'm doing the mixing here, and again I'm going to be using a dry brush. Dry brushing is your friend with this kind of work. You want to get it done fast. You don't want to waste your time. The quicker you can get this work done, the better. Because terrain's not particularly stunning in terms of like detail work, but what's really good about it is because you're working with large surfaces, it's very easy to get good distance results. In other words, stuff that looks good on the tabletop without too much actual work. And this total painting project took me probably about an hour and a half, including some waiting times, because I didn't use the hairdryer the entire time. But if you are in a rush, you can get this done fast. And there you can see I'm leaving recesses. Sorry about the camera again. I need to learn to shoot more, actually work more in the frame. But this is new to me. So there I am trying to get it more in the shot. So you can see I've left loads of recesses, and it's looking good. You can already see it's starting to look like a thatch roof, and it's starting to become more and more familiar. I'm not particularly careful here either, you'll notice. I'm just kind of whacking the paint on, as long as it's not on too thick and it's not completely obscuring the dark brown. And there you go, that's the second phase of the roof done. And at this point I then get my same dry brush and I start working on the paneling on the walls. Now this is going to be a much lighter color, but again I'm trying to build up layers. And one of the things I'm trying to achieve here is leave the paint somewhat tacky. You'll see I'm using the yellowish brown from the actual cap of the paint. Now that's dried out somewhat, so it's a very, very tacky paint. And what I'm doing here, as I'm layering this on, it's creating a kind of patina and giving the walls texture, because the actual plastic molding itself is quite smooth. But what I want to achieve is a kind of, I guess, a wattle and daub style wall for a kind of medieval British style building. And so what I want to do is give the wall an unevenness which doesn't actually exist without too much work. And so what I'm doing is I'm putting thick layers of paint on here intentionally to create a kind of minor undulations and striations in my brushworks. In other words, the brushwork here isn't clean. It's supposed to look messy because it's supposed to look organic, and it's like something somebody's actually made by their hands. And so this patina that I'm working on here is the reason you'll see several layers of the yellow going on. It covers better. As I mentioned, these are very poor pigment paints, so they don't tend to cover very well, especially on dark surfaces. But the more you use them, and if you're quite sort of generous, you can create this patina level, which works well. So anything that has a smooth wall, like if you were using just plastic card to build your own terrain, I would suggest you do this just to kind of give it a bit of an organic feel, a bit of a profile, rather than just being sheer. And this is probably the most tedious part of the job. Actually, no, the most tedious part of the job comes towards the end. This is still good times. This is just rattling through the work and getting it done. You'll notice that my hairdryer blows my paper everywhere. That was not smart by me. If I were doing this again, I would suggest that you anchor down your paper, probably spread it out wider, and anchor it down with some washers or something, just so they don't go blowing everywhere. Okay, now moving on to like an ivory color, and the same thing again. It's a terrible paint in real terms. But it works well for what we're about to do, because what I'd like is I want a strong contrast between the beams, the wooden beams that frames the building, and the actual walls themselves. And it's difficult to see at this range, but what I'm doing here is I'm leaving nice thick gaps around the edges, so it looks a bit grimy, looks like it's outside, looks like it's a stable basically. But I do want that white finish, because that whitish finish is going to balance nicely against the darker timbers that surround everything. As I mentioned before, one of the great things about these Tabletop Workshop kits is the fact that they are very cheap. They're pretty much all the same in terms of their basic construction, so the floors all tend to be much of a muchness. If I were to do it all again, I would simply buy one of each kit, potentially 2, say, cottage kits, and then I would just I would do all the floors in one go, all the roofs in one go, and just that way save myself a lot of time and hassle. But since this was a learning experience for me, I took the time to kind of paint each one individually. Okay, so now I'm moving on back to my dark brown, and all I'm doing here is neatening up the wooden frames. I want the wooden frames to look nice. I want them to be solid, because the eye here is going to naturally try and pick up the contrast between the wooden beams and the actual kind of ivory color walls. As much as I've been quite untidy with the initial phases, this is the cleanup phase, so this is the most tedious part that I mentioned earlier, because all I'm doing now is recoloring in what I did earlier. Now the problem you've got here is that, as I mentioned, these paints are particularly tacky, and they're not very good at watering down. So when you're trying to do detail work like I am here, it can be quite tricky to get the paint to the right consistency to work well, so you tend to use a lot of paint. And at this point here, I'm using Spear Point, which is a foundry color, and I am just coloring in some of the details. Basically, like there's like a rake and a hoe and stuff leaning against the wall. These are the little details. They're inside, so there's not a huge reason to put too much effort in, but it's nice to just put some contrast in. So I put a bit of lead belch of our Games Workshop to do sort of a horseshoe that decorates the wall. And again, I'm using my ivory and I'm just tidying up. That's all I'm doing. I've spilled a little bit, so I tidy it up because we want it to look neat. And here we go. So the walls are fitting on nicely. Oh, I'm playing with the zoom there, and you can see we're almost home. Buildings aren't glamorous, so for instance you're going to have a lot of browns. These are not exciting colours, but they are necessary colours. So like with the window shutters there, I've done them in a kind of lighter brown, just to again provide some contrast, but I don't want them to wash into either the walls nor be overshadowed by the actual wood frame. So I went for a relatively neutral brown colour. If you were doing buildings in Greece or something, you might want to do more colourful shutters, because that's more appropriate for that kind of area. But I'm not aware that in Britain that was ever a thing, people painting their shutters. And here I'm just dry brushing a slightly lighter tone of the same Spear Point by Foundry. Again, with this sort of work, I would not recommend you use good quality paints, but obviously there's no point buying a big giant tub of paint to just do window shutters when there's so little to do. And we're done. That's it. Okay, and here's the finished product. There's the box art, and in the foreground is my finished product, and it looks good. It's a bit of bleeding on the walls. That's intentional. And this is a useful little scenario piece. Now, I do hope you found this video helpful and informative. I hope that the format worked okay, and any feedback, please as always write them in the comments. You can have a look inside here. I've used no glue with this. The only bit that got glued at the end was the roof, sorry, to make sure that it didn't collapse like it did when I took it off there. But that's it. I mean, you can just imagine this being the centerpiece for a scenario: horse rustlers trying to steal from a medieval town. Thank you very much for watching, and please do subscribe. I'm hoping to get more content out all the time, and I do hope that this was very, very helpful to you. If it has been, please do let me know. It's always nice to hear from subscribers. Thank you.